Have you ever had that unsettling feeling that despite all the knowledge we've accumulated, all the technological achievements we've reached, and all the material comfort we've built, something fundamental is missing? That feeling of emptiness that appears in the most unexpected moments when you're driving alone late at night, or when you wake up at 3 in the morning and the silence around you seems to amplify the emptiness inside you. It's as if there were a deep disconnection between the world of technological advances we celebrate and the internal reality we experience. This feeling is not new in human history, but it takes on particular forms in our era. For millennia, human civilizations built elaborate systems of beliefs, rituals, and practices to deal with this existential emptiness. We call these systems religions, spiritual traditions, or philosophies of life. They offered answers to the great questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? And what is the meaning of all this? For thousands of years, these answers were enough for most people. They provided a map of the cosmos and of humanity's place in it. A Paleolithic hunter-gatherer who saw spirits in animals, trees, and rivers had a world full of meaning. A medieval peasant who believed his life was part of a greater divine plan did not question the meaning of his existence in the same way we question it today. Their world was enchanted, populated by invisible forces and beings that gave meaning to natural phenomena and human experiences. But then came the scientific revolution, and with it, a gradual process of disenchantment of the world. Modern science gave us unprecedented power over nature, but at the same time emptied the universe of inherent meaning. Planets were no longer divine spheres guided by angels, but masses of matter following the laws of physics. Diseases were no longer divine punishments or magical spells, but biological processes caused by microorganisms or cellular dysfunctions, and human beings were no longer a special creation at the center of the cosmos, but a product of evolution by natural selection, a primate that developed extraordinary cognitive abilities by evolutionary accident. This new understanding of the world brought enormous benefits. Life expectancy skyrocketed, child mortality collapsed, and we achieved a level of material comfort our ancestors would consider magical. But at the same time, it created a vacuum of meaning. If we are only clusters of atoms following the laws of physics, if our consciousness is only an epiphenomenon of neurochemical processes, if the universe is indifferent to our existence, then what is the meaning of all this? Why do we care about anything? It is in this context that the contemporary phenomenon many call spiritual awakening emerges. Faced with the existential emptiness of modernity, people around the world are seeking to recover some kind of transcendent connection, some sense that goes beyond material existence. However, this search happens in a world very different from that of our ancestors. We live in an era of scientific skepticism, cultural globalization, and technologies that are rapidly reshaping what it means to be human. Contemporary spiritual awakening cannot ignore these realities. And this is precisely the point I want to explore today. What does it mean to seek a spiritual connection in an age of advanced biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and an increasingly deep scientific understanding of the human mind? What happens when the ancient quests for transcendence collide with new consciousness-altering technologies. For thousands of years, human beings sought altered states of consciousness through practices such as meditation, fasting, ecstatic dance, or the use of psychoactive plants. These practices were typically embedded in religious frameworks that gave them meaning and context. A shaman who consumed ayahuasca in the Amazon was not simply having interesting visual hallucinations. He was entering into contact with the spirit world to obtain healing or knowledge. A Buddhist monk who meditated for hours was not just reducing his stress, he was working to reach enlightenment and free himself from the cycle of suffering. But today, many people seek these experiences outside any traditional framework. They participate in meditation, retreats without adopting Buddhism as a philosophy of life. They experiment with ayahuasca in hybrid ceremonies that mix elements of various traditions, or they consume synthetic psychedelics in purely recreational or therapeutic contexts without any reference to the sacred. This decontextualization of spiritual practices is a new phenomenon in human history, and its implications are not yet fully understood. At the same time, neuroscience is mapping with increasing precision what happens in the brain during mystical or meditative experiences. We know that long-term meditation alters the structure and function of the brain. We know that psychedelics, such as psilocybin and LSD, reduce activity in the default mode network, a neural network associated with self-referential thought, allowing new connections between brain regions that normally do not communicate. These findings are fascinating, but raise troubling questions. If we can mechanistically explain how mystical experiences arise, does that make them less meaningful? If we can artificially induce states of consciousness that traditional mystics took decades to achieve, does that devalue the traditional spiritual path? And if in the future we can directly manipulate neural circuits to generate experiences of cosmic unity, universal love, or ego dissolution, would that count as a genuine spiritual experience? These are not merely theoretical questions. Technology companies are already developing increasingly sophisticated brain-computer interfaces. Neuroscientists are experimenting with transcranial magnetic stimulation and other techniques to modulate brain activity. And the emerging field of psychomedicine is exploring how psychedelic substances can be used to treat conditions such as depression, anxiety, and addictions. In a few decades, we may have technologies that allow us to induce practically any state of consciousness on demand. What will that mean for the human spiritual quest? I want to pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this deep disconnection in your daily life? This feeling that despite being more connected than ever through technology, something essential has been lost along the way? I know it can be hard to put into words. Many of us carry this weight in silence, believing we are the only ones to feel this particular emptiness. But you are not alone in this. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel this disconnection when," and completing the sentence with your personal experience. Your comment may be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel that they are not alone in their struggle. Sometimes, naming what we feel is the first step toward transforming it. Returning to our discussion, to better understand the contemporary phenomenon of spiritual awakening, we need to look at history. In the past, spiritual experiences were not sought as ends in themselves, but as part of a broader path. A medieval Christian mystic like Meister Eckhart or Teresa of Avila did not seek ecstatic experiences for pleasure, but as stages in a path of approaching God. A practitioner of tantric yoga in ancient India did not visualize chakras and subtle energies to have interesting experiences, but as part of a transformative process aimed at spiritual liberation. Spiritual experiences were embedded in comprehensive cosmological and ethical systems that gave them meaning and direction. Today, however, many people seek spiritual experiences in a cultural and philosophical vacuum. They want the experience of expanded consciousness without the commitment to a system of beliefs or practices. They want the feeling of transcendent connection without the communal and ethical obligations that traditionally accompanied spiritual traditions. This raises a crucial question. Is it possible to have an authentic spiritual awakening without a context that gives it meaning? Traditional spiritual masters would say no. In Zen tradition, for example, there's a famous saying, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." This enigmatic phrase warns against confusing extraordinary experiences with true awakening. Experiences of ecstasy, visions, or altered states of consciousness may be milestones on the path, but they are not the final goal. In fact, they can become obstacles if we cling to them. In Christian tradition, mystics such as Saint John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness that paradoxically could represent more authentic progress than visions or ecstasies. These traditions suggest that true spiritual awakening is not about accumulating extraordinary experiences, but about a fundamental transformation in our relationship with existence. A transformation that manifests not only in special moments of meditation or contemplation, but in how we live our daily lives, how we relate to other beings, how we respond to suffering. Here, an interesting tension emerges with modern individualism. In most ancient spiritual traditions, the spiritual path was not a matter of individual self-improvement, but of participation in a greater reality. The practitioner did not seek to improve personal well-being or accumulate spiritual capital, but to completely transcend the notion of a separate self. However, much of the contemporary discourse on spirituality is deeply infused with individualism. We speak of my journey, my personal growth, my awakening. Spiritual practices are often presented as tools to improve individual life. Meditate to reduce your stress. Practice yoga to improve your well-being. Use psychedelics to increase your creativity. There is something paradoxical in using practices that traditionally aimed to transcend the ego to instead strengthen a more satisfying individual identity. And this tension intensifies in the age of social media, where spiritual experiences become part of the construction of online identity. People share their ayahuasca experiences on Instagram, post enlightenment quotes on Twitter, or document their meditation practices on YouTube. The deepest and most ineffable inner experience becomes, ironically, a social commodity to be displayed for external validation. This does not mean that all contemporary spiritual pursuits are superficial or inauthentic. Far from it. Many people are engaged in deeply sincere and transformative explorations. But it means that we navigate a complex terrain full of traps and contradictions, a terrain where ancient technologies of consciousness transformation meet new technologies of information, communication, and biotechnology. And it is precisely this intersection that makes our era so fascinating and so risky from a spiritual point of view. Think, for example, of the implications of artificial intelligence for the human spiritual quest. As we develop increasingly sophisticated AIs, they begin to simulate aspects of the human experience that we once considered exclusively ours. We already have algorithms that create art, music, and poetry. We have chatbots that offer psychological and spiritual advice. In the future, we may have AIs that convincingly simulate deep meditative states or that compose spiritual texts indistinguishable from those written by human mystics. What will this mean for our understanding of spirituality as an exclusively human phenomenon? If an AI can perfectly simulate the behavior of a spiritual master, does that make the human spiritual quest less special? Or would it reveal that part of what we consider spiritual is in fact an algorithmic pattern that can be reproduced? These questions lead us to a fundamental point. What are we really seeking when we talk about spiritual awakening? Traditionally, religions offered clear answers. In Buddhism, we seek liberation from suffering through understanding the nature of mind and reality. In Christianity, we seek union with God through love and grace. In Vedanta Hinduism, we seek to recognize our essential identity with Brahman, the universal consciousness. But today, many people seek spiritual awakening without a clear map of the territory. They feel a longing for something greater, an intuition that there must be more to existence than the materialist narrative suggests. But they do not have a coherent cosmology or metaphysics to guide their search. This is a new challenge in human history. Our ancestors always had maps. Even if different cultures drew different maps, they could disagree about the ultimate nature of reality, but they rarely questioned the existence of a transcendent reality. Today, we not only have conflicting maps, but many of us doubt the very existence of a territory to be mapped. The scientific materialist paradigm suggests that nothing exists beyond the physical world, that consciousness is merely a product of the brain, and that when we die, our conscious existence simply ceases. Within this paradigm, speaking of spiritual awakening seems an anachronism, a nostalgia for an enchanted world that science has disproven. But does the materialist paradigm capture the whole truth of human experience? Many contemporary philosophers, scientists, and contemplatives argue that it does not. They point to the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? How do configurations of atoms and molecules produce the experience of seeing the color red, feeling pain, or falling in love? This problem remains intractable within the materialist paradigm, suggesting that our current understanding of reality may be fundamentally incomplete. Some go further and propose that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of reality, not merely a secondary product of physical complexity. Philosophers like David Chalmers suggest that we may need a kind of neutral monism or panpsychism, where consciousness and matter are two sides of the same coin, two ways of describing the same underlying reality. These theories are not necessarily spiritual in the traditional sense, but they open space for a more expansive understanding of consciousness than strict materialism allows. What is interesting is that some of the world's oldest contemplative traditions, such as Madhyamaka Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, have long proposed views that resonate with these contemporary ideas. They suggest that the subject-object duality, the separation between observer and observed, is an illusion produced by the conditioned mind. Through deep meditative practices, it is possible to dissolve this illusory duality and recognize the non-dual nature of reality. These traditions do not deny the reality of the physical world, but suggest that our usual understanding of this world is partial and distorted by our conceptual categories. True awakening, from this perspective, is not an extraordinary experience within our usual conceptual framework, but a fundamental transformation of that very framework. Here we find another interesting parallel with contemporary science. Quantum physics has revealed that at the subatomic level, reality behaves in ways that completely defy our intuitions based on the macroscopic world. Particles can be in multiple places simultaneously until they are observed. Distant particles can be entangled, influencing each other instantly, regardless of distance. Some physicists suggest that the very notion of objects existing independently of observation may be fundamentally flawed. Once again, these discoveries are not spiritual in the traditional sense, but they challenge the naive materialist vision and suggest that reality may be stranger and more wonderful than our conditioned minds can conceive. These developments in science and philosophy create an intellectual space where the old and the new, the scientific and the contemplative, can potentially find points of contact. It is not a matter of returning to pre-scientific worldviews, but of recognizing that modern science, at its most advanced boundaries, may be beginning to touch upon insights that contemplatives reached by other means. But even if we accept the possibility of an authentic spiritual awakening compatible with a scientific worldview, we still face the crucial question of how this awakening relates to our practical lives in the world. Historically, spiritual traditions incorporated not only metaphysics and contemplative practices, but also ethics, guidance for community life, and a vision of how spiritual awakening should manifest in concrete human relationships. In Buddhism, for example, compassion, karuna, is inseparable from wisdom. Awakening does not mean merely recognizing the nature of mind, but manifesting this understanding through compassionate actions in the world. In Christianity, love of God is inseparable from love of neighbor. Mystical union with God must be expressed in service to others, especially the most vulnerable. In Hinduism, the recognition of the Atman in oneself implies recognizing the Atman in all beings, naturally leading to an ethic of non-violence, ahimsa, and service. In all these traditions, spiritual awakening is not just an individual realization, but something that fundamentally transforms how we relate to others and to the world. This raises urgent questions for contemporary spirituality. If our awakening does not translate into a greater capacity to respond compassionately to suffering in the world, what kind of awakening is it? If our spiritual practices make us more peaceful individually, but do not mobilize us to address the systemic causes of suffering, are they fulfilling their complete function? These questions are particularly sharp in our era of interconnected global crises. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, extreme economic inequality, political polarization, and now the emergence of potentially transformative technologies such as advanced artificial intelligence. What would a truly awakened response to these crises look like? Some contemporary contemplative traditions are trying to answer this question, developing what is sometimes called engaged spirituality. The Vietnamese Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, taught that true meditation is not separate from compassionate social action. The Dalai Lama promotes what he calls secular ethics, an approach to morality based on compassion and the recognition of interdependence that can be practiced by people of any religion or none. These examples suggest that an authentic spiritual awakening for our time must include not only the transformation of individual consciousness, but also an active commitment to transforming the conditions that cause unnecessary suffering in the world. This brings us back to the question of technology. The same technologies that are transforming our understanding of consciousness and potentially offering new pathways to altered states are also fundamentally reshaping our societies and creating new ethical challenges. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, virtual reality, neurotechnology, all these innovations have the potential to expand our capabilities in unprecedented ways, but also to exacerbate existing inequalities, concentrate power in the hands of a few, and potentially alter the very nature of human experience. A spiritual awakening relevant to our time cannot ignore these realities. It is not a matter of rejecting technology, but of approaching its development and application with wisdom and compassion. We need to ask not only what can technology do, but what should technology do? Not only how can technology expand our capacities, but how can it help alleviate suffering and promote the flourishing of all beings? For these to be more than abstract questions, we need people who combine technical understanding with contemplative depth, who can navigate both the world of algorithms and the world of inner experience. This is a new kind of bridge between worlds that have historically been separate. The world of the how, science and technology, and the world of the why, meaning and purpose. This integration will not be easy. Contemporary technological culture, especially in Silicon Valley, often displays a form of technocratic utopianism that believes all human problems can be solved through engineering and optimization. This vision tends to reduce complex questions of meaning, purpose, and justice to technical problems to be solved with the right algorithms. On the other hand, some spiritual communities reject modern technology and science, seeing them as inherently dehumanizing or materialistic. They seek a return to simpler and more natural ways of life, often romanticizing the pre-industrial past. Both approaches are inadequate for the challenges we face. We need to integrate the best of modern science and technology with the deep insights of contemplative traditions. We need a vision that is neither techno-utopian nor neo-primitivist, but one that recognizes both the transformative potential of technology and the perennial wisdom contained in spiritual traditions. I need to ask, as we explore these ideas together, at what moments in your life do you feel most intensely this search for meaning we are discussing? Those moments when the distractions fall away and you ask yourself whether you are living in accordance with what truly matters. I know that many of us keep these questions only to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming too intense, too philosophical, in a world that values the superficial and the immediate. But here, in this space, your deep reflection is welcome. Share in the comments. I question the meaning of my life when, and complete with your personal experience. Your honesty may illuminate the path for someone who is going through the same existential crossroads, showing that we are not as alone as we think in our deepest questions. Continuing our exploration, another crucial dimension of contemporary spiritual awakening is its relationship with the global ecological crisis. Many ancient spiritual traditions recognized the fundamental interdependence between humans and the natural world. For indigenous peoples, nature was not a resource to be exploited, but a web of living relationships of which humans were only one part. In animistic cosmologies, natural elements, plants and animals were seen as conscious beings with whom humans could communicate and negotiate. Even more theistic traditions often emphasized human responsibility for divine creation. These views were largely marginalized with the advent of industrial modernity. Nature was progressively desacralized, reduced to resources to be extracted for human benefit. The results of this worldview are now evident. Accelerated climate change, massive biodiversity loss, widespread pollution, degradation of soils and oceans. These are not merely technical or political problems, but spiritual ones, in the sense that they reflect a profound alienation between humans and the rest of the web of life. A spiritual awakening relevant to our time must include an awakening to this ecological interdependence. It is not about romanticizing nature or returning to pre-scientific worldviews, but recognizing that we are part of complex living systems on which we completely depend and for which we are responsible. Some contemporary contemplative traditions are explicitly incorporating this ecological dimension. Deep ecology, developed by philosopher R. Nace, inspired by Buddhism and other traditions, proposes an expanded identification of the self that includes the natural world. Ecotheology explores how religious traditions can ground a robust environmental ethic, and practices such as mindful walking in nature, seasonal rituals, or retreats in natural environments are being incorporated into contemporary spiritual paths. These approaches suggest that an authentic spiritual awakening today must include an awakening to our interdependence, not only with other humans, but with the entire community of life on Earth. But what does it really mean to awaken to this interdependence in an age of advanced technology. We cannot simply return to pre-industrial ways of living or abandon the real benefits that science and technology have brought. We need to find paths that integrate our scientific understanding of ecological systems with a renewed sense of connection and responsibility for the natural world. Here again, we see the need to integrate the ancient and the new, the scientific and the contemplative. Science shows us the extraordinary complexity and interconnectedness of living systems. James Lovelock's Gaia theory, for example, suggests that Earth functions as a self-regulating system similar to a living organism where the biosphere and the physical components of the planet evolve together as a single self-regulating system. This scientific view resonates with ancient spiritual intuitions about the fundamental unity of life. Similarly, systems ecology shows us how every organism is embedded in networks of relationships, with nothing truly existing in isolation. This scientific understanding of ecological interdependence can become not only intellectual knowledge, but a direct realization through contemplative practices that expand our identity beyond the limits of the individual ego. This is not mere sentimentalism, but a more accurate understanding of reality than the illusion of separation that dominates modern consciousness. This ecological awakening has profound practical implications. If we genuinely realize our interdependence with the natural world, we cannot continue with practices that degrade the living systems on which we depend. We are compelled to reimagine our economies, technologies, and ways of life so that they are regenerative rather than extractive. This is not a matter of sacrificing human well-being to save the planet, but recognizing that true human well-being is inseparable from the health of the broader living systems of which we are a part. But how could entire societies undergo such a transformation? How do we move this realization from the individual level to the collective? This is perhaps the greatest challenge we face, and it is here that the spiritual dimension meets politics and economics. The current systems of power and wealth creation have vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Economic structures are oriented toward perpetual growth on a finite planet. And cultural and psychological identities are deeply rooted in unsustainable consumption patterns. Transforming these systems requires not only new policies or technologies, but a transformation in collective consciousness. Some contemplative traditions offer valuable insights for this challenge. Buddhism, for example, has long recognized how habitual mental patterns create suffering and how these patterns can be transformed through mindfulness and inquiry. Similarly, we can bring mindfulness and investigation to the habitual collective patterns that are destroying the planet's life support systems. Indigenous traditions offer decision-making models that consider impacts on the next 7 generations. And various contemporary spiritual movements are exploring how practices of face-to-face dialogue, deep listening, and community development can create microcosms of a more conscious and compassionate culture. No single spiritual tradition has all the answers to the complex challenges we face. In fact, the very diversity of spiritual traditions represents a wealth of wisdom we can draw upon. Different traditions illuminate different aspects of human experience and offer different practices and insights. This diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a richness to be celebrated. What matters is not which specific tradition we follow, but the depth and authenticity with which we embody it in our lives. And for many people today, the path may involve integrating insights and practices from multiple traditions, as well as incorporating understandings from modern science, psychology, and other fields. What is crucial is that this integration is not superficial or eclectic, but grounded in consistent practice and genuine inquiry. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, what aspect of this technological future we are discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that often we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about our technological future is, and complete with your thought. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them, and perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine paths for addressing them. Now, returning to our exploration of spiritual awakening in the technological age, another crucial aspect to consider is the relationship between the individual and the community. In most ancient spiritual traditions, the spiritual path was practiced in a communal context. Buddhist monks lived in sanghas, Christians in parish or monastic communities, Hindus in ashrams. These communities provided practical support, guidance from more experienced practitioners, corrections when someone strayed, and a sense of shared purpose. However, much of contemporary spirituality is deeply individualistic. People download meditation apps that they practice alone in their apartments. They read spiritual books without discussion with others. They watch videos about spiritual growth without any connection with the creators or other viewers. This individualization has benefits, making spiritual practices more accessible and adaptable to individual circumstances, but it also loses something crucial, the transformative power of community. Social neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman argues in his book, Social: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, that the human brain evolved primarily for social interaction. We are fundamentally relational beings, shaped by our connections with others. Our minds are not contained in our individual heads, but distributed across the networks of relationships in which we participate. If this is true, then an authentic spiritual awakening must include not only a transformation of individual consciousness, but of the relationships and communities in which we are embedded. Perhaps this is why many people report deep spiritual experiences in contexts of intimate human connection, during an intensive group retreat, in a meaningful communal ceremony, or even in moments of profound intimacy with loved ones. In these moments, the boundaries of the individual self temporarily dissolve, and we experience a deeper connection with something greater than ourselves. This is the reason why, despite the individualizing tendency of modern technology, we see a growing longing for authentic community connection. People form meditation groups, spiritual study circles, intentional communities, or seek immersive retreats where they can practice intensively with others. These contemporary communities rarely have the formality or hierarchical structure of ancient traditions, but they seek to recover the transformative power of shared practice. Technology plays an ambivalent role in this process. On one hand, digital technologies allow connections between people with similar spiritual interests who would otherwise never meet. Someone interested in an obscure tradition or specific practice can find other practitioners online, even if they are geographically distant. Meditation apps increasingly include community elements, allowing practitioners to connect and support each other. And video platforms allow people to watch teachings from spiritual masters of diverse traditions to whom they would otherwise have no access. On the other hand, the digital mediation of spiritual experience brings significant limitations. Online interactions lack the richness of shared physical presence. Digital communication tends toward superficiality and fragmentation. And the design of social media platforms often optimizes for engagement rather than genuine transformation, creating an environment that can work against contemplative deepening. Furthermore, the very nature of digital technology creates a kind of ontological atomism, dividing experience into discrete and representable bits, which can reinforce rather than transcend the sense of separation that many spiritual traditions seek to dissolve. To navigate this complex terrain, we need to be both critical and creative. Critical as we examine how the technologies we use shape our consciousness and relationships, and creative as we reimagine how these technologies can be designed and used in ways that support rather than undermine authentic spiritual development. This leads us to another crucial question: the relationship between spiritual awakening and ethics. In many ancient traditions, spiritual development was inseparable from ethical development. In Buddhism, ethics, sila, is the first of the three trainings preceding meditation, samadhi, and wisdom prana. In the Christian tradition, love of God is inseparable from love of neighbor. In Islamic Sufism, the tariqah, the spiritual path, always includes adab, refined ethical behavior. This suggests that an authentic spiritual awakening must manifest in how we treat others, how we respond to suffering in the world, and how we live our daily lives. However, we see disturbing cases where alleged spiritual masters with apparently deep realizations commit serious ethical abuses. Gurus who sexually exploit their students, spiritual leaders who accumulate wealth at the expense of their followers, or supposedly enlightened communities that become coercive groups or abusive cults. These examples raise an uncomfortable question. Is it possible to have genuine spiritual realizations without corresponding ethical development? Perhaps what we are witnessing in these cases is not an authentic awakening, but merely altered states of consciousness or intellectual insights not fully integrated into the personality as a whole. A partial awakening may even be more dangerous than no awakening, as it can give people an inflated sense of spiritual achievement without the corresponding transformation in how they treat others. This suggests that we need a more integrated understanding of spiritual awakening, which recognizes the interdependence between the transformation of individual consciousness and the transformation of social relationships and structures. A genuine awakening cannot be only an internal subjective experience, but must manifest in an expanded capacity to respond compassionately to suffering and create conditions for the flourishing of all beings. This is particularly relevant in our era of interconnected global crises. What would a truly awakened response to climate change, systemic injustice, geopolitical conflicts, or the existential risks posed by emerging technologies like advanced artificial intelligence look like? These questions have no simple answers, but suggest that an authentic spiritual awakening for our time must include an active and engaged dimension, not only contemplative and introspective. This does not mean that all spiritual practitioners must become political activists or social entrepreneurs. The paths for responding to suffering in the world are diverse, and different people will have different roles to play. Some may focus primarily on their own spiritual development, creating a foundation of clarity and compassion from which they can act more effectively in the world. Others may become directly involved in transforming social, economic, or political systems. Still others may dedicate themselves to supporting and nurturing others in their own development paths. What matters is not the specific form engagement takes, but that it is rooted in a genuine understanding of our interdependence and in the compassion that naturally arises from this understanding. The fundamental question we face is, how can we create conditions that support authentic spiritual awakening on a social scale? How can we cultivate not only awakened individuals, but cultures and social systems that embody the values and understandings we associate with spiritual awakening? I do not have definitive answers to these questions, but I believe they point to the crucial work of our time, integrating the best of ancient contemplative wisdom with our modern scientific understanding and our advanced technological capabilities to create new forms of life that are both materially sustainable and spiritually fulfilling. This work requires a genuinely interdisciplinary approach that transcends the divisions between science and spirituality, technology and the humanities, individual contemplation and collective action. It requires us to re-examine deeply rooted assumptions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and what it means to be human. And it requires us to be willing to experiment with new forms of practice, community, and governance that can support the flourishing of all beings in a deeply interconnected world. Ultimately, I believe that true spiritual awakening in our era is not an escape from the complex and often disturbing world we inhabit, but a deeper engagement with it. It is not a transcendence that denies our embodied humanity, but an expansion that embraces it more fully, recognizing both our vulnerability and our capacity for transformation. It is not a final state to be reached, but a continuous process of unfolding as we navigate together the challenges and possibilities of this extraordinary moment in human history. If you have come this far in this journey of ideas with me, I want to express my gratitude for your sustained attention in a world so full of distractions. The questions we explore today do not have easy answers, but the very act of considering them seriously is a step on the path of awakening. If these reflections have touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space of dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. The path of awakening is not something we walk alone, but together, supporting one another as we navigate the uncertain and wonderful territory of being human in this unique moment in history. And remember, true awakening is not an escape from reality, but a deeper entry into it with all its challenges, contradictions, and extraordinary possibilities. Thank you for being here, and until our next meeting. We are going to see AI changing even things like religion. Religions which are based on texts, like Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, they give ultimate authority to the text, not to any human being. Now, until today, humans were nevertheless the main authority in these religions because the texts could not speak. The Bible could not interpret itself. The Bible could not answer your questions, so you needed a human being as an intermediary. What happens when you have an AI text that can speak for itself? No Jewish rabbi can know all the texts of Judaism because there are too many of them. For the first time in history, there is something on the planet that is able to remember every single word in every writing of every rabbi in the last 2,000 years and talk back to you and explain and defend its views.
Darwin is the kind of prophet of sexual liberation. If I think about the liberation of gay people, of LGBTQ people, then if you dig underneath, you eventually find Darwin. For centuries upon centuries, gay people were persecuted and oppressed because of this mythological idea about sex, that sex was created by God for the purpose of procreation. And if you use sex for anything else, you're sinning against the purpose of the thing, so you must be punished. And then Darwin came, and Darwin said, in biology, there are no purposes. Nothing has any purpose in biology. In biology, there are only causes.
You don't have children. Is part of the reason you don't have children because you are fearful for the future?
No, it's not a conscious decision. I just never really thought about it. It's not
That's
something
so refreshing to hear.
It's just, sometimes I tell people it's the same way I don't have an elephant. I just never thought about it.
I love that. I've never had that response. I'm someone who doesn't have children, and that's just such a wonderful thing to hear. Thank you, Yuval.